Welcome, everyone, to Mythstorie, a podcast about myths and history. Cammy, I don't like to say the podcast because I don't want to be like singling out our podcast as being the quintessential podcast for myth and history related podcasting. Hey, Cammy.
Oh, but we are.
Yes. So, if you're joining us now, I'm Bryant. That's Cammy, and this is Mythstorie. So every week, we will talk about a legend or a myth or history. We'll give you a little slice of that myth in story form, and then we try and unpack a little bit of the history behind it. Today, we're going to return to Greece, right?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. Thank God. All right. Oh my gosh. Okay.
That was a lot of Greece in a row, though.
We're done with Greece. That's it. We've covered it. We've nailed. It's done. No, we're going back to 1001 Nights, the stories, the Arabic, multicultural stories, but the 1001 Nights stories that we've hit on in the form of Alibaba's a few weeks ago. I can't remember how long it's been now.
It's at least a month and a half, I think.
Yeah. Those were really fun too. I really enjoyed those stories because I really hadn't heard them, and that twist ending, oh my god, that was amazing. So
this isn't quite as twisty
yes,
as that one.
yeah. So who are we talking about in the 1000 Nights?
We're actually talking about Sindbad the Sailor.
Is this related to the comedian at all?
I don't. I mean, he might have gotten his name from Sindbad the Sailor. I'm not really sure. I bet if either one of us had ever listened to any of his comedy specials, we would know this, but I haven't.
So we'll put it up front. This is going to be a two-parter, just like Alibaba was. And I guess the second part will just focus entirely on Sindbad the comedian then, right?
Yeah, that's the point.
No, so we're going to talk about the tales of Sindbad, and which is a part of 1001 Nights, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit and remind anyone or introduce you to the 1001 Nights stories, because there's a lot more there than what may appear in the animated videos on YouTube that are really weird. But well, Cammy, can you set the stage and bring us into Sindbad?
Sure. So one day, after many hours of carrying wares, a porter named Hindbad came to rest upon the stone wall of a very wealthy man in Baghdad. As the smell of perfume overcame his senses, Hindbad prayed loudly about his troubles. The man inside the mansion heard his words and invited Hindbad inside of his home. Hindbad was fed all sorts of exotic dishes and the best wine in the region. After his host was sure the man had finished dining, he set about to explain that while he enjoyed a lavish life now, it was not without toil. The host, whose name was Sindbad, had squandered everything his father had worked for, so he had to set sail to make a new fortune. Sindbad's first tale began when he was a merchant. Sindbad's first tale began when his first merchant voyage was almost over. The men decided to embark on an island instead of spend another night on the rocky sea. Just as they were settling in, the island began to shake, and most of the crew fled the ship, leaving Sindbad behind. He quickly realized this was no island, but the back of a giant whale. He had been tossed in the sea, but fortune was on his side. He washed up on a real island and was able to climb up to dry land. He met the stable hands of a very rich king who wanted his horses to mate with the horses of the sea. They were the only one.
Freaky.
They were only going to be on the island one more day, so he was lucky to have met them. He traveled back to the king's palace and lived there some time, until the sailors who had left him came to the land of this king, wanting to sell Sindbad's belongings. He was able to convince the captain of his identity and sold his belongings for vast wealth, then returned to Baghdad to purchase a house and property. Soon Sindbad grew tired of life without adventure, so he set sail again, and with some trusted merchants. It wasn't long before these men left left him on an island by mistake. So he's left on an island twice now.
Yeah.
Our hero is once again stranded. By chance, he came upon the egg of a giant rock. He hid beneath the egg, and when the bird landed, he tied himself to its talons, hoping for a quick escape. His plan worked. The bird took him far away from that island. He unfortunately was dropped in a giant ravine when the bird went hunting for prey. This ravine was the home of huge snakes, which would swallow an elephant whole. He hid in the cave for the night, and the next morning he awoke to find that the place where he was stranded was filled with diamonds. He had heard stories about men who threw meat on top of the diamonds in this place so that eagles would carry them out to their nest. The men would then retrieve the diamonds from the nest. Sindbad tied himself to some meat after filling his bag with diamonds. He was then carried to an eagle's nest. There were men waiting above, and he explained his circumstances to the men and gave one of them a diamond for his trouble. Before Sindbad set for home, these men told him of the rhinoceros and its enemy, the elephant, and how lucky he was because the rock he tied himself to would wait until these two beasts were engaged in battle and then come down and eat them both. When Sindbad returned to Baghdad, he distributed his great wealth among the poor. He was still young, however, and wanted to return to adventure as soon as possible.
I need to get on another island.
Yeah, get stranded again, and he will. He went on a third voyage for treasure. It wasn't long into his adventure that a terrible storm came along and landed his ship near an island known for the cannibals that lived there. The small men who inhabited the island swam out to the ship and quickly overtook it, dragging it to shore. These red-bearded people led the crew to their palace, where the bones of men in a pit for cooking them was the centerpiece of the great hall. Soon after, a horrible giant with the single eye came and scooped up the captain and drove a spit through him. The giant then cooked and ate him. He then went to sleep in the hall. Sindbad convinced the remainder of the crew to make rafts and take their chances at sea. The next night came, and the giant ate another man and went to sleep. When everyone was certain he was really sleeping, they drove spits into his eye and ran to find a hiding spot. The giant couldn't find the men, so he opened the door to the great hall. They ran out to the shore where they had left their rafts the night before. And okay, if they could get out, this is my problem with this. If they could get out and put their rafts on the shore, they obviously didn't need. I am so sorry. That cat is like really trying to get in this room. Okay, good. But yeah, if they could get out and put the rafts on the shore, why didn't they just leave then? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
But as they were about to leave, more giants came and hurled great boulders at them. Only Sindbad and two other men were left alive. The rafts were tossed into another island, which was rich with fruit. They ate and went to sleep upon the shores. They were awoken by a terrible hissing in the middle of the night as a snake came and ate one of the remaining men. The other two fled and ran up a tree. The horrible snake followed and was able to grab the other member of the crew from his low branch. Sindbad clung to the safety of the high branches and waited until morning. The next day, he built a rampart, and just before dusk, he lit it on fire. The snakes were frightened and went elsewhere for their dinner. The next morning, a ship was sailing by, and Sindbad flagged it down. What ship was this but the one from his second voyage? He was given his belongings from that trip. He was then able to sell his wares for exotic spices and return to Baghdad even richer. So that's where we're going to end the story.
Okay.
There's
that's great.
4 more adventures though.
Yeah. So, I am aware of the stories of Sindbad the Sailor, but I looking into it, I see there's 7 like parts to a collective story. What parts did you cover here?
Basically, just the first 3.
Oh, okay. So that was like the first 3 kind of put together. So you're chunking them that way.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah, I read. I wanted to keep it broad. I like to learn about it, but I wanted to learn the content of it from this, like I did with the last one, for Alibaba and the 40
Well, to be fair, it's a lot to read. Like,
yeah.
Yeah. So
No, it's great. Well, I'm gonna kind of do what I did last time, and we're gonna talk about more of the broad stories of A Thousand One Nights and some of the origins of the tales, and then I'll kind of go into some of the more specifics next time. Because the 1001 Nights stories, it's a really complicated history. So these stories are a huge collection of stories from Asia. And I mean, when we say Asia, we might not think of like what they call West Asia, which is like the farther. I'm trying to look at a compass in my brain, like the far east of the Middle East, including that area. But we're talking of like South Asia with India, and then go further into Pakistan, then into what we kind of consider the more traditional Middle East. But these stories include Greek, Jewish, Turkish, all sorts of other kind of collaboration of stories, and then going into Arabic and Persian things as well. Now we kind of see it more as like an Arabic thing, and I think that's because when it was first translated by like Western entities in the 17th century, it was based off of those Arabic translations. But yeah, basically these stories are they were written. The first fragments of the writings were found in like the 9th century, but the stories within them are much older. Like I don't know how old, but like they could be like Odyssey style old. And surely they've evolved over time. Now, Sindbad is interesting because it was a really late addition to the 1001 Nights. So I have like a collaboration of sources, but the standard Britannica stuff was really good. And it sort of talks about how Sindbad stuff was probably based on what's the early Abbasid period, which is like 750 to 850 AD, which makes sense. But all the other stories kind of have a flowing timeline, though, but because of the technology and things like that of sailing and the places that he goes to, it kind of makes sense that that's where that comes from. But in general, the 1001 Nights take place over this huge story. Now, going back to sort of what the 1001 Nights are, that's describing this woman, Scheherazade, I think I said it right on the first time. So this
Good
woman,
job.
yeah, this woman, the idea behind the 1001 Nights is that this woman is like captive, basically, and she is trying to stall her from her captor by saying these stories every night and like keep them coming and going. She's basically starting her own podcast for her life. Which
Just
is
trying to
basically
stay alive like I
what
am.
we are doing. Yeah. So she comes like the collection of them happened much later than when the stories actually occurred, and even when they occurred, they weren't really even popularized, I would say, until the 17th and 18th centuries. I was looking at my old notes, so if you loved the Alibaba episode and listened to it 100 times, you might you're going to hear a little bit of that. But even in the Arab world, these stories weren't fondly looked at. They kind of are now, although even my sources say that what is it? There's a great article from thoughtco.com talks about how in the Arabic translations of the Arabian Night stories, the 1001 Night stories, the Sindbad the Sailor is absent. So it's kind of interesting. But the Scheherazade stuff, the actual collecting of the stories happened much later. So it's really interesting. Someone just sort of wove all these stories together in this way. It's kind of like, I mean, it's sort of like Homer and the Odyssey. Like these were known sort of characters, and he just kind of did something with them, I guess is one way you could put it without being an expert on Homer. But that's the fun thing about these stories, though, is they come from a lot of different places. They each have their own spin on them, and they predate they're collecting, and so it's just sort of interesting that way. But since now that you know Scheherazade, 1001 Nights, so for Sindbad, it's a little more specific. So I'll kind of brush on it a little bit before we end. It looks like the name Sindbad, which I see it referenced as Sindbad with a D, Sind bad, is based off of a Persian name. And that's where a lot of the story has its roots from, although it's not entirely certain. But that's sort of the argument of where a lot of the connection of these stories is from Persian origins and some of the references that they make. Although the Thought Co., like I said, it said that in Arabic translations, Sinbad was absent, but they also assert in that article that Sinbad might be referenced to this Arabic merchant, Suleiman al-Tajir, which means Solomon the merchant in Arabic. And he was a known merchant around the year 775 BC, who went from Persia to China in the Indian Ocean trade network. So that was interesting, but I guess
so
I don't know.
So he was like a real person?
Well, I think his stories might be based on someone. There's definitely, at least from what I could see, there's no person named Sinbad.
No, I mean the person that you just mentioned was a real person.
Yes. Suleiman al-Tajir was a real person who he was Arabic, it seems.
Okay.
Not Persian. And so, and there is, it's difficult, and I could definitely not do it justice, but like Persian people is what we would know as modern day Iraq. And there is a difference between Arabic and Persian, especially because today we don't really say Persian per se.
Yeah.
I believe it is an ethnicity, but we wouldn't go to Iraq and say, oh, there's Persia, you know.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a little different, a little complicated. Like I said, I won't be able to do it justice, but there is a difference, although a distinct connection between Arabic, and Persian. So yeah, Sinbad it looks like it has like his name is definitely his Persian roots, and there's even like that's the interesting thing. Like they think some of the sailors that he was based off of came from like it could have been like an Indian merchant who was told in like a Persianized story, but then is retold in Arabic, and then some German dude translated in the 17th century, and then
kind of like Aladdin was Chinese.
Yes,
firstly.
That's a really good. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. A lot of people don't realize that the origin of the story is, and that's like these complicated trade networks. If these stories like. I don't have an exact date of when the Sinbad stories were written, but again, they were added late, and these stories were collected around the 9th century. So, but between the 9th and 17th century is when these stories were sort of starting to flourish. So you can, and I'm going to get into it next week, but there's references, there's connections to things like the Silk Road, Marco Polo, things like that. So this busy time, and up until the industrial age, merchants were like the key to everything. They were traders. That was everything was merchant and merchant networks. And so the stories behind it was really cool. So, but we'll go on to a little bit behind a little more behind Sinbad next time.
I think one thing I do want to assure the readers, we are going to get into the parallels of the Odyssey, which obviously the last story was probably directly from the Odyssey, but we're not omitting it because we don't know or because we're not familiar. We're omitting it because we're going to talk about that next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a little bit more here, and we could have made like a really long single episode or split it up. With a global pandemic, it's a little easier for us if we split up.
Plus, it would be so out of character for us to have an hour-long episode. With just the two of us.
Without Peter to help us out. So I think that just about covers it for now. Just to kind of prime you on Scheherazade and things like that, the 1001 Nights. And we'll finish up the story next time, and then we'll go a little bit more into the person of Sinbad. next week.
Yeah, and I just want to, before we finish, shout out to Peter, who is doing on Mondays the Mythstorie After Dark
Yes.
at 9 p.m. And then also this week we are doing, because this will go up on Wednesday, so on Friday we are doing another Petersode, and so hopefully we'll be back in that swing where we can have a Petersode every couple of weeks instead of using them on Wednesdays, because I think we've got the recording done enough to do that. We were worried, with the pandemic and all, that we wouldn't be able to record, but we figured out a way. So
Yeah.
we should be good there.
Awesome. Well, Cammy, thank you for the first part. I anticipate the next part, although I really encourage, if like you loved this one, go back, listen to the two Alibaba stories. The Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, really funny, or a really good story, and it has an insane twist ending. So this one should be fun too, though, and there'll be some cool parallels that we make to the Odyssey and things like that next time. So thanks again, Cammy.
Oh.